nosotros tenemos un traductor aquí y les damos como monitores para que escuchen. ¿Nadie aquí necesita traducción? ¿No? Ok, si en caso alguien necesita, el muchacho Omar que está ahí atrás, él puede venir con ustedes y les puede dar algo para que ustedes escuchen esto, porque el programa va a ser en inglés, pero tenemos un traductor aquí.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Tony. I am an organizer with the Dallas Housing Coalition. If this is your first event with the coalition, welcome. We are a nonprofit organization, boasts over 225 members now, that formed, launched officially in June of 2023 with 65 members, so you can see the growth that we've had as a coalition since then. At the beginning, we rallied around the 2024 capital bond package. We're successful in advocating for $82 million to be dedicated to Propositions G, H, and I for housing and homelessness solutions. So give you guys a hand for all your support for those propositions. We're now shifting our attention to Forward Dallas, which you'll hear discussed through our panel today. This is the second of two-part series that we've done with Rayo Planning, the first of which happened a couple weeks ago at Casa Guanajuato in Oak Cliff, where we asked what are the trends telling us, and we had representatives from Child Poverty Action Lab, BC Workshop, as well as Colin Clark from the Bush Institute discuss what are some of the stats and figures on our affordable housing shortage. And today we're of course following that up with how do we actually close those gaps. So really excited to be here and be partnering with Rayo Planning in their housing justice movement. We encourage you to follow the Dallas Housing Coalition on all of our social media channels. Sign up for our newsletters and communications at the back of the room if you are not already receiving them. And we'll continue to move housing forward in Dallas. We will continue to make housing a priority, not just financially, that's one piece of the puzzle, but also through various policy reforms that we're getting to hear more about today that will both create and preserve more housing across the city of Dallas for all. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Rangel, Executive Director and co-founder of Rayo Planning, tonight's moderator. In addition to her work at Rayo, Jennifer previously worked besides one of our panelists and Lott at the Inclusive Communities Project as a planning and community outreach director. Jennifer also holds a master's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in city and regional planning. The past 6 years, she has worked alongside Dallas neighborhoods to address fair housing and environmental issues. I'll turn it over to Jennifer now to further introduce our panelists for the evening and facilitate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and the entire Dallas Housing Coalition. I'm really excited to have every single one of you here today. Thank you so much for being here. I also am really thrilled for the panelists we have here, all phenomenal women I deeply admire, and I'm excited to engage in this conversation with them. It's really critical within the city of Dallas. As always, Rayo Planning, we are an urban planning nonprofit with 3 pillars: environmental, housing, and economic justice. And with that in mind, we also always like to acknowledge, as we talk about places for Dallas and land, we have to recognize the land that we do stand here today and the ancestors that were here before us and other individuals as well. So we will start off with a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was co-created with Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, as well as Downwarders at Risk. Rayo acknowledges that today's event is being held on ancestral and stolen land on indigenous tribes, including the Tobaconi, Wichita, and Iroquois people. We recognize that this land has nurtured joy, tradition, and community for these indigenous tribes, who's experienced genocide and forced removal by European colonizers. We also acknowledge that indigenous people and communities, they are still here. We honor the work and resilience of these indigenous educators, community members, and elders that continue to care for the land and all the life that it does sustain. We recognize that we're here today by efforts supported by Native indigenous communities, including education, preservation, and advocacy. We also acknowledge the indigenous people of Africa, who were enslaved and forced to labor, building the economic foundation of Dallas and the country, which now often systematically excludes their descendants. The migration of immigrants and refugees to Dallas is rooted in settler colonial practices by the United States, displacing these people from their indigenous lands. Their contributions have profoundly shaped and enriched our community, economy, be friends, neighbors, and fellow builders of our shared future. We recognize the significance of this collective history and our part in it today. This land generously provides us with gifts of a place, as we say, to live, work, and play. Reflecting on its abundance and how we can reciprocate this generosity, we are called to reflect on our responsibilities to the well-being of both the land and its people. With all of this in mind, let us intentionally move forward with the well-being of the land and its people as its focus. So now, another exciting part of this evening is to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Lott, Executive Director of the Inclusive Communities Project, and is also acting as the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Mobility Works, and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Housing and Neighborhood Law Project. And has also previously worked with the Dallas Housing Authority, and is a stellar advocate in the fair housing space, and so it's also an honor to have you. Please join me in welcoming Lott. Our second panelist we can also welcome is Maureen Milligan, the Field Director for the Central Team of Pro-America, formerly known as the National Development Council. Maureen is a board member of the Lone Star Justice Alliance and is a sustaining member of the Junior League of Dallas. Maureen holds a Juris Doctor from the American University Washington College of Law and also has a stellar history within the city of Dallas when she used to work for the city of Dallas, and that's how we initially connected, and has some phenomenal work that continues to happen here. And I'm really excited to have her here and very honored. Please join me in welcoming Maureen. And another person I'm also very thrilled and excited to invite here on the stage is Stephanie Champion. Stephanie is the Chief Community Development and Policy Officer at Builders of Hope Community Development Corporation. Stephanie previously worked with Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, where she completed a fellowship with Equal Justice Works and holds a Juris Doctor from UCLA School of Law, and is also someone who's been very active in the organizing space as it relates to fair housing and environmental justice, and it's also an honor to have her here with us today. So please join me in welcoming. Just to recap, and Ryan shared this as we kicked off, at our previous panel, one of the recurring messages that we kept hearing is that the housing units are limited within the city of Dallas. It's just not meeting the demand that we are seeing today. However, we also know that we cannot just simply rely on the market to solve our housing crisis. Primarily because when we look at the Dallas neighborhoods, whether it's north, south, east, west, we do see that there's still an echo of legacy of discrimination, segregation, and redlining. We cannot just assume that the housing crisis will be solved with just one housing solution. So this is why we're here to talk about how complex housing can be, but most importantly, that it needs to be done with fair housing in mind, because that is the law of the United States. So to level the conversation, I'm just going to define what is the Fair Housing Act, 1968. The act protects people from discrimination when they are doing several things: renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. Meaning that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on these protected classes: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, and disabilities. And so when municipalities receive funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, not only do they have to uphold the Fair Housing Act, they have another obligation. That obligation is to affirmatively further fair housing. And that's going to be one of our components of our discussion this evening. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started with asking Anne. ICP's work is rooted in the Fair Housing Act and its purpose and meaning of why it was even created to begin with. Historically, how has ICP advocated towards the city of Dallas to affirmatively further fair housing?
I'm really tempted to ask how much time do I have? Let me Walker Project, and the Walker Project was formed around 1990 as a result of a consent decree entered into by the city of Dallas with the Walker plaintiffs who sued the Dallas Housing Authority. The Walker plaintiff class are comprised of African American applicants and participants of DHA's housing programs. So our focus historically has been for the African American population, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge that the racial demographics of this city has changed since 1985. And we are becoming increasingly more brown. And so I believe that our work also impacts our Latino brothers and sisters, and I am prepared to also discuss that impact. So the Walker Project exhausted its funds in 2001 and was disbanded, and around 3 years later, in 2004, Betsy Julian rebranded the organization and called it the Inclusive Communities Project. So I'm sharing this history with you because I really want to emphasize that this organization has had a long history with the city of Dallas. We recognize, as you do, that affordable housing is not always fair housing, particularly when you're dealing with low-income people of color. We believe that where you live is important, and residential segregation creates barriers that denies access to equal opportunity in the city and in the country. And as long as you can segregate people by race, you can continue to perpetuate those kind of barriers. And so our mission is basically to redress the barriers of fair housing by expanding the supply of affordable housing. And we want to address the barriers at every level of government. We also seek to address the housing policies and the housing practices that perpetuates discrimination in HUD's housing programs. So we believe that this effort requires intentionality. Market forces are not going to resolve this problem because market forces didn't create this problem. We're talking about the city of Dallas, and so I'm going to suggest to you that the city of Dallas has created this problem. And part of the Fair Housing Act requires not only that HUD enforce its obligation to prohibit discrimination in housing, but it also requires that HUD and all of its recipients of HUD funding take steps to overcome the patterns of discrimination and take steps to foster inclusive communities. So let's talk about the city of Dallas. They received in 2024 over $29 million in HUD funding. So the city of Dallas has an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. They received more funding than any other city in the state of Texas except for Houston, and Houston received almost $50 million. So the city of Dallas received $29 million, the city of Houston $50 million. ICP has advocated for the city of Dallas to take meaningful actions to redress the patterns of segregation that was established as early as 1930 when they defined where public housing would exist, and in 1950 where they defined Negro neighborhoods and neighborhoods for Mexican Americans. Today, 81% of the city's public housing is still in high poverty, high minority areas. 97% of the city's low-income housing tax credit units are located in high poverty, high minority areas. 74% are located in high poverty areas. High poverty is defined by HUD as any census tract where the poverty rate is higher than 20%. It's considered to be extremely low income or properties would be located. They determine where the public housing is built. They determine where the low-income housing tax credits are built. Therefore, the city of Dallas needs to take affirmative steps to overcome and redress the pattern of segregation that they established in its affordable housing programs. So, and we believe that they can do this by supporting the development of affordable housing in low poverty areas where the poverty rate is below 10%. We do feel like the city is making some changes. I'll tell you what I mean. In 2023, you'll remember this, Jennifer, there was a developer that he wanted to build housing off of Forest Lane. And he needed city support and city funds in order to do that. And when he went to the city's Public Facilities Corporation, a corporation that was established, right, to expand affordable housing, his request was denied. And his request was denied because it just wasn't the right neighborhood. This was the Public Facilities Corporation whose job it was to expand affordable housing. The developer then went to the city. He made an appeal to the city and made his case before the horseshoe at the city council meeting. And basically, we were there to support this developer and brought to the city's attention the demographics that I just shared with you. The developer brought to their attention how the tax credits were allocated by district, by city council district. And they noted that areas where there was the highest poverty, they had the highest number of tax credit units. So the city of Dallas did approve this developer's request. I think that's worth mentioning because they did it for all the right reasons. And historically, they have not moved in this direction. However, over the last 5 years, 64% of the units that were approved by the Dallas City Council has been in some of the higher poverty areas. There's a lot more I can say about it, but I think that as we continue the conversation, there's going to be more that I can add to the discussion.
Thank you, and for providing the context to where we are today. Because I think a lot of times, too, the issues we see on the ground, it has to be informed with how did we get here to begin with? What can we learn from that to avoid that from happening again? Stephanie, just broadly speaking, could you share the different types of neighborhoods that you've noticed across the city of Dallas? And how does that context of these neighborhoods influence those housing solutions? And talk a little bit about.
Yeah, thank you. First, can I just take a step back and introduce myself and my organization? So my name is Stephanie Champion, as Jennifer said. I'm Chief Community Development and Policy Officer with Builders of Hope CDC. We are a Dallas-based, multifaceted community development corporation. And we, first and foremost, build and preserve quality affordable housing in areas across the city. But we also build communities and cultivate public policy through our community transformation initiatives. And those are what I laid out on our team. And one of those is looking at creating a citywide anti-displacement toolkit, which I'll talk more about later. I promise I won't get into that yet. But one of the things we're doing with that toolkit is trying to map neighborhoods across the city and understand specifics of socioeconomic and market pressures, socioeconomic factors and market pressures impacting different neighborhoods and what is contributing to those displacement pressures and how do we really see neighborhoods changing. But I'm going to pause there and go back a step again, because when you ask that question, there's so many different directions I could go, and I brought this up to you before, and I'm glad that Anne went before me, because the first thing I want to talk about is the history of residential racial segregation in our city that has created this north-south divide, right? I don't want to lecture Dallas residents about Dallas neighborhoods and our history, but it's important to reiterate that. So, and I'm glad you went first. So that's the first thing I think about. And then our displacement efforts and how we're trying to categorize and map these neighborhoods. But the thing I want to focus on today, while I have you all here, because it's so pressing with the conversation around Fort Worth, Dallas, is what is a neighborhood, and who gets to define what a neighborhood is, and who is included and who's excluded from that definition. So we have, neighborhoods across the city. We have a perception that there are single-family neighborhoods, and there are multi-family neighborhoods, and then there are business centers, and there are commercial corridors, and there's this use and that use, and they're all separate. And that's a very kind of rigid way to approach zoning and thinking about zoning and planning, and it's just not what we see on the ground in our neighborhoods. So if you look at any single-family neighborhood in Dallas, you are going to see some multifamily uses, and maybe the folks in the neighborhood association don't consider the multifamily across the street as part of their neighborhood. But if you ask anybody in that apartment complex, they're going to say, "No, I live in this neighborhood. That's my neighborhood." So we do see a lot of diversity in housing uses and in neighborhoods. But at the same time, there is a lot of difference and disparity. When we look at, as Anna mentioned, like neighborhoods of high opportunity and then neighborhoods of high poverty. And there is a very large gap there, and it's a gap that we need to aim to fill with our housing solutions. So we need to be doing both. I completely agree with creating inclusive communities, and I think we need to look at strategies to to create inclusive communities in areas of high opportunity, and to increase that opportunity and increase that inclusivity in areas of low opportunity and high poverty. And we do that by increasing access to economic opportunity and diversifying housing options. So we believe that all neighborhoods should have diverse housing options. So everyone, regardless of race, income, education, any other protected class, that you have access to housing in whatever neighborhood you seek.
Thank you, Sunny. Maureen, as I shared when we kicked off today, you worked with the City of Dallas at the time. There's a housing policy was being worked on, as well as many other implementations of programs, policies, and you even helped with drafting some city ordinances on the books today. What were some of the challenges you faced when trying to address these housing issues in the city, and are there any solutions that we can all here collectively advocate for?
Well, first of all, I want to say how excited I am to be on the panel with two amazing women who I actually met so I was in the city attorney's office for a decade and then moved over to the housing department. And I consider myself a relatively intelligent person, but learning housing and housing acronyms and housing finance, it's a humbling experience. And both of these ladies participated in the Housing Policy Task Force, and I learned a lot from both of them. So just really excited to be on the panel with the both of you. So I'm going to start with the solutions first, just one suggestion of a solution, and really a call to action for everyone here, regardless of whether you just got involved in housing advocacy through the coalition or whether you've been involved for a long time. You've put in a lot of effort. You've learned those acronyms. You actually can probably explain what area median income means, or at least you know it means something important related to housing. You may have heard of CDBG. You've heard about all these crazy different entities we like to create, like public facility corporations. So don't let all of that go to waste, right? So that you've already had a significant victory with the bond being passed related to affordable housing and economic development, but there's a lot more to be done. And it's affordable housing advocacy is a marathon, not a sprint. And I'll give you an example. We can celebrate when we get a bond passed, or the next thing we'll celebrate is when there are projects that are funded or approved. But I think one of the big critical missing pieces we have right now is we don't have a true understanding in the city of Dallas of where our affordable housing units are, and do they exist? I mean, it's kind of an existential question, but I think there are three things that are related to that. One, once this project has been funded, is it actually successfully completed? In Dallas, we have a history of funding projects that don't actually get completed. We even have, groundbreakings and they not be happening. So one, did it get completed? Two, do the people who are responsible for actually managing the property, which is often very different from the people that get the funding for the housing, do they actually know they have a responsibility to provide affordable housing units? Heather Way, who many of you may know at the University of Texas, her community development law clinic published a paper on public facility corporations, which is one of the tools we can create affordable, mixed income affordable housing. And her students surveyed public facility funded apartment units and asked, one, do you have a unit, to the property manager, the leasing manager, and two, how many units do they have? And they encountered too many properties where the property manager, the leasing agent, either said we don't have any affordable units, and 51% of the units were supposed to be affordable, or two, the number of affordable units they said they had was a lot less than was actually supposed to be provided. So one, did the project get completed? Two, are the units actually on the market? And three, because at the end of the day, our work, we're doing this work for the low and moderate income families that need housing to be safe and to access opportunity. Do they even know where these units are? How do they go find the units? I was looking at a website today preparing for the panel, the PFC funded development in West Hollis, and they have a tab that says essential housing, because we don't like to say affordable housing, right? Because what does that connote about the quality of our development, right? And so it had some verbiage about if you're a teacher, you're a firefighter, there may be units that you can access, but you have to call us. And it didn't say what the units were, how many bedrooms, or the prices. So it was just an additional step. So one thing I would encourage someone in this room or a group of folks in this room have the ability to advocate, design, fund an affordable housing database. Right? We have the technological capabilities for us to design a database that has a user interface that someone that may not be English speaking, that may have visual disabilities can access and can find affordable housing for their families, and on the rental standpoint as well as on the for sale housing standpoint. And until we are doing that, I have a lot of uncomfortableness about the fact that we really do have the housing units on the ground that we say. Because until families can actually access and occupy those units don't really exist. So that's my view. I think the challenge, and this is really going back to things that Ann and Stephanie said, is if we're thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, which like Ann said, we don't just have to try to, the city of Dallas doesn't have to just try to prevent housing discrimination. We have to affirmatively take steps to further fair housing choice. And there are really two interrelated strategies that cities, if you have a robust fair housing policy or a strategy, you're engaging in. One is the place-based investment. So we're recognizing that we have neighborhoods where there was historic disinvestment, there was deliberate segregation, and there was environmental racism. There were other factors that kept the population of that neighborhood segregated and not having access to opportunity. So we need to make place-based investments that add opportunity to that neighborhood. And then we also have to give families the opportunity to access neighborhoods that already have all of those factors in place, that have the access to jobs, that have the access to transportation, that don't have the environmental concerns, that have the high-quality public schools. So if they want to move out of their existing neighborhood, they have to be able to do that. But like Ann talked about in the history of Dallas, we've focused on one thing, which is building the affordable housing in the neighborhoods that are historically disinvested. And we don't take that added step to have place-based investments that add opportunity to those neighborhoods. And so I think that was the biggest challenge as a city staffer. Is the easiest thing to do is to build the units. The much more difficult thing is to stay committed to a neighborhood over multiple election cycles, over multiple city budgets, and then also to help families access housing in neighborhoods where it's much more likely that you're going to face intense opposition from neighbors, as well as just a lack of interest from developers. So I think that was the biggest challenge was to keep
to right offhand. I'm sure Maureen and Jennifer can think of many more, but Floral Farms comes to mind, with the Shingle Mountains, the Jockey neighborhood, with the cement batch plant. We all know that these industries would have never seen the light of day, right, in a neighborhood that was predominantly white or that was low income. It just wouldn't happen. And so often I feel like these neighborhoods were just kind of left to fend for themselves. But I really think we would make a lot more progress, and when we see this kind of thing happening, is that everyone, regardless of your neighborhood in Dallas, will come and fight alongside of the people who are fighting for equity in their communities. And then the last thing, Maureen says, we don't really know where the affordable housing is. I echo that concern. I think I have a little bit more information because we do surveys, and so I know, and I am only speaking primarily to the voucher holders, that's a significant part of the population that we serve, but we know that 91% of the landlords in these lower poverty areas will not take a housing voucher, even those who are required to, because they have low-income housing tax credits. And so the result of that is that 76% of the voucher holders who live in the city of Dallas live in a community that is extremely high poverty or high minority. If they want to really truly access opportunity, they have to move out of the city of Dallas.
Thank you all for sharing that context, and also already the call to actions as well. Moving to the second part of today's panel, and something that came up at the last panel was disparate impact and that rationale and the effects that it had on the ground. Of course, I have to ask you because it includes the Inclusive Communities Project because it's related to the 2015 U.S. Supreme Court case with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. From your perspective, how has the disparate impact rationale been used to address some of these housing challenges on the ground? And could you provide just a very brief overview for those who might not be too aware about this court case? Because some would even call that the disparate impact rationale was a landmark ruling that didn't just have effects here in Texas, but nationwide.
That's a really great question. Thank you. What I'll share with you is that when you look at fair housing in the city of Dallas, disparate impact was used by the fair housing attorneys when they sued HUD, the Dallas Housing Authority, the city of Dallas, and the state of Texas through the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Disparate impact is important to maintain because people will generally say two things when they get sued for violation of fair housing. Because you can be sued individually for violating fair housing. The first thing they'll say is, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. But if we can show, and in fact you did, right? Then the next thing is, well, that wasn't my intention. And we know that two of those things can be true, and government organizations can still be guilty of discrimination because it's the policies and practices that drive the patterns of segregation that we see today. So disparate impact basically doesn't need to place that blame on any one bad actor. Disparate impact just takes a look at the result. When you're looking at housing, where is the housing located? And so in all of those cases, the plaintiffs were able to prevail because there was a pattern of housing that couldn't be explained any other way other than there must have been some force at work that drove the racial patterns that we see. So ICP basically did not take the case to the Supreme Court. It was the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs that appealed to the Supreme Court because they had issue with the fact that they were determined to have discriminated in the implementation of their housing programs. Fortunately, the Supreme Court agreed that disparate impact is a valuable way to determine whether or not the Fair Housing Act has been violated. However, and it was determined by a 5-4 vote. There was some changes. there is a prima facie case, or there is enough evidence that supports that there is a clear causal connection between the policy and disparate impact. That's the first thing. If they're unable to make that case, then there is no disparate impact. ICP was successful in making that case by simply pointing to the housing patterns, not only in the city of Dallas, but in DFW. And you can make the same argument for every urban area within the state of Texas. So that's the first step. Secondly, what's different is that the defendant has to be given the opportunity to make a case that there is a prevailing interest at stake. There is a governmental, there is a reason that this needs to happen, the way that we implement the program. Such governmental interests could be the need to revitalize communities that have been impacted through redlining would be one such reason that they could use for housing. So they have to show that there's a reason why we've implemented the policy this way. And when that's the case, if the plaintiffs cannot come back and basically demonstrate that there's another way that they can reach the same objective without disparately impacting a class of people, if the plaintiffs cannot do that, then they don't have a claim for disparate impact. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, and Stephanie, you already shared a little bit about it, about the anti-displacement toolkit, which is something that Builders of Hope has been actively working on. Could you share what you envision for the toolkit to do citywide? And then also, if there's any key findings you would like to share with us today.
Sure. So just to place it in context of the fair housing conversation, as Maureen mentioned, is like two kind of strategies. One is this place-based investments, and the other is like creating access to opportunity. So the toolkit really focuses on the first strategy, right? But it's rooted in this philosophy we have, which is that all residents should have the right to stay and the right to choose to leave. So we're focusing on this right to stay, but the right to choose, the right to move into another area, an area of high opportunity, is just equally as important. But with regards to the right to stay, that is something we feel really strongly about. And why we're embarking on this work is that we know that there is an affordable housing crisis across the city. DFW is one of the fastest growing areas nationwide. We know that housing is not keeping up with demand. CPAL recently released a study last year that showed we have a gap of 33,000 units for folks making 50% of the area median income below. So for our most vulnerable renters, that's who we have the gap for. We know that homeownership is declining while home values are increasing. We know that 5 out of the 10 zip codes in the state of Texas that experience the most rapid rise in home prices are in the city of Dallas, and 3 of them are in our anti-displacement case study areas. And we know that rents are accelerating, and renters are most vulnerable to displacement. And here's something you might not know, because it's not a big part of the conversation, is that Dallas is actually a city of renters. We are 60% renter households versus ownership households. But so many of our policies and our policy priorities for the city are focused on ownership. And so we're really missing out on a huge population. But that's all the context of our affordable housing crisis. All of that is felt so much more severe in areas that of historic disinvestment that are feeling the pressures of gentrification. So these are the areas that, as both Anne and Maureen have mentioned, these are the areas that have been redlined. These are the areas that have been intentionally areas of historic disinvestment where Black and brown communities were forced to live because they did not have access into other areas. So West Dallas, South Dallas, so much of our southern sector. I'm not sure if a lot of folks know. Sorry, my son just walked in. I don't know if a lot of folks know the history of West Dallas. Ann mentioned the Walker litigation. That came out of folks who were trying to move out of the housing projects in West Dallas, which was one of the largest low-rise public housing development in the country was right here in West Dallas, and it was placed there intentionally to continue to West Dallas was acquired into the city of Dallas for the sole purpose of acquiring more land on which to build segregated housing. And they put that segregated housing directly across the street from a toxic lead smelter. And South Dallas has an equally, harmful history as well. I realize I'm going far too down I'm going off track a little bit, but I'm talking about the context of these neighborhoods of historic disinvestment. And as the city grows, as the urban core grows, suddenly these areas are now attractive to private developers. But they are attracted to private developers specifically because of certain characteristics of that neighborhood. One, the depressed land values because it's an area of historic disinvestment. Two, the proximity to the urban core. And three, targeted public investments that have attracted private market activity in that area. So with West Dallas, it was the construction of the Margaret Hunt Bridge. In Bishop Arts, it was the streetcar that we just talked about last night, sorry. In South Dallas, now it's the revitalization of Fair Park, right? There are always strategic public investments that spur this. So there's a lot of different circumstances happening, but it's easy to spot where this is going to happen when you're paying attention to where those public investments are being announced and carried out. So, all that to say, our vision for this toolkit is, to create meaningful policy change in the city of Dallas that will allow for vulnerable residents the opportunity, the right to stay in their neighborhoods and the opportunity to return as they face rapidly rising housing costs. We also hope that opportunities remain in that neighborhood for new and future existing and future vulnerable residents to move in. Those will be affordable units on the ground that we need to know where they are and need to make sure that we are preserving them when they're coming up for renewal of their land use restrictions. And the third piece of that is making sure that all residents, but especially those most vulnerable to displacement and most impacted by development decisions, have a meaningful role and a seat at the table when it comes to public investments and development decisions impacting their neighborhoods. So we hope that this toolkit, we are privately developing, this is privately funded and developed by Builders of Hope CDC, but we are hoping that it will be adopted as public policy when we present to the city of Dallas in the fall. So a couple of key findings are kind of the stats I mentioned earlier, but for some of our key policies that we're going to be pushing, we have about 30 or so recommendations, but we also want to clue into what are the most meaningful interventions that the city can do now, and hey funders, if there's any funders in the room or listening or reading our toolkit later, here are great opportunities of organizations, of nonprofit developers or other groups that are doing this work already on the ground that are ready for your investment. So that's our goal with this toolkit. But some of the things, the call to action, I almost wanted to step in and say, well, we have a call to action too. Some of the things you guys mentioned are play central roles in our toolkit too. So, Maureen, you mentioned kind of like a single database to track these properties, but also for developers, but then also for renters who are seeking these homes, right? A key strategy that we need to implement, and I think is already on the city's radar, is creating a affordable housing preservation network and creating a database to track at-risk properties, because we are losing our affordable housing stock much faster than we are building it. And we are losing it from the rental side, we're also losing it from the single-family homes. So that's where the Forward Dallas conversation comes into play as well. But creating that database to track at-risk properties, creating affordable housing preservation network, creating funding mechanisms so folks interested in preservation have access to financing so they can acquire these properties swiftly in order to step in before the interest restrictions run out. And then also that kind of single entry database for renters seeking, so they know exactly where they're going. That's one tool. Another big tool is to have more robust tenant protections. In Texas, tenants don't have very many rights at all. And it's very tough for tenants who are facing substandard living conditions, certainly when they're facing evictions or any kind of dispute with their landlords. The deck is just stacked against them when they go to court. So if we can require more robust tenant protections at the very least in properties that are receiving city subsidies and incentives, which we know that there's a significant amount, and at least if the city can be a model for how to do that, then we can ask the private market to start doing that as well. And then one cool tool that I mentioned is really investing in community resource building and community engagement and what's the word I'm looking for? Community organizing. Thank you. Because that's really what this comes down to, is building community power. Because once you do that, when you empower and engage tenants, when you empower and engage low-income residents who are most impacted by these decisions, when you give them a meaningful seat at the table, then that's when this whole conversation starts to change. And we make sure that development is accountable to the folks who are most impacted by it.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think we could publish a book. Informational book. Maureen. That's the goal. That's the goal. That's the launch pad. Maureen, at Grow America, you work with different municipalities to assess their housing strategies with specific links on market analysis. Based on your understanding of the North Texas region, what are some critical strategies the City of Dallas should implement in order to develop and rehabilitate mixed income, single family, and multifamily housing developments?
Yeah, so I left the City of Dallas about 5 years ago and joined a nonprofit. And one of the primary reasons was to get exposure to working with clients who are outside of the City of Dallas. Sometimes if you work for an organization for too long, you've got one set of thinking. And so I've really been excited to have the experience working with clients across the country, primarily in the North Texas region and Southwest region. I think one of my biggest suggestions would be, so when we work with clients from an affordable housing standpoint, there are really 3 categories to focus on. What are your development needs? There's always a need to develop new housing, affordable housing units. And then what are your preservation strategies that you need to focus on? And then economic mobility, how to help families increase their purchasing power so they can access market rate housing. So vouchers is one of the primary tools. And then we work with clients within those main categories to really assess what their needs are. And I think that's something that really gets lost within the affordable housing conversation. And again, all of you in the room are much more educated now, right? You understand that there's a difference between an affordable housing unit that's targeting a family that's making 100% of the area median income versus a family that's earning 50% of area median income. But if we just keep the conversation at affordable housing, I can promise you the units that get created are going to be the units that are targeting the highest income individuals, because that benefits everyone, right? Because then we don't have to worry about considerations about those people and what are they going to do to our neighborhood when they move into our neighborhood, or a rental housing developer. How is it going to impact my community? to target teachers and firefighters and police officers. Absolutely, we have to make sure that our first responders can live in our community because they serve our community. But we've got sanitation workers, we've got paralegals, we've got paraprofessionals, we've got folks working in your hospital that also are in need of housing. We've got disabled individuals that are not able to work but still need to live in safe and secure housing. And so as we assess needs, we really need to look at, we know there's a deficit of affordable housing units, but where is that majority deficit? And CPAL helped us understand that deficit, the really pressing issue on the rental income, or on the rental side, was families that are earning half of the area median income and below. And I was on the bond committee for the housing bond, and we advocated for language to be included in the resolution that was calling for the bond election, that there should be a targeting of those bond dollars to those lower income units. That didn't make it in. And so it's going to take advocacy from groups like yours to make sure that the units that are getting created are not just targeting 80 to 100%, 20% AMI, but they're targeting the families that really are not able to access housing anywhere else. The same kind of thing in terms of looking at the market. Right now, even though we recognize in a lot of communities that families are not able to access for sale housing, when you have communities that might have $300,000 or $400,000 of CDBG funding that they can spend each year, and then we do an analysis for them and recognize that for even an 80% AMI household to be able to purchase a home, you have to give them a $200,000 subsidy for them to be able to purchase that home. That means that you're creating maybe 1.5 units. And so making sure families can access for sale housing has got to be part of your strategy, but it might not be part of your strategy right now. So it's helping clients understand what's the market now, how do we address the needs now in the most cost-efficient way to serve the most families, and how do we plan, how can we create a framework in the field so that we can also help families access different types of housing at different times. So with displacement prevention, when you know that those public investments are going to occur, the public entity knows it before anybody else does, right? So that's when you start acquiring the land before the land values increase. So there are things that we've learned from other jurisdictions that we can do. So we help clients understand the timing of their investments, the use of their investments, and then how to bring partners together, right? So from a voucher standpoint, how do you start educating landlords about fair market rents, and how in a lot of communities fair market rents and voucher payment standard is higher than what they could get from someone just paying a market rent, right? And so how do we help landlords really understand that this can be a financially beneficial relationship to accept vouchers? So another call to action would just be continue to educate yourself on affordable housing, and when you're engaging in advocacy, really try to get into some of the nitty-gritty details, because I will tell you that the political forces, the development forces, the neighborhood forces are just going to push the conversation to serving the highest income households, and that's not often where the need is. So it is folks who can really go into the details and can say, here, we know what the data says. We need to be creating housing that's really meeting that.
Okay. I'm so glad you said that, because that is one of our recommendations too. That I didn't have a chance to say is appropriately targeting affordable units to vulnerable residents, because we are not doing that. We're not serving the folks who most need it.
Thank you. And I have one last question for the panelists. And so if anyone has questions, we'll go ahead and open it up after this question, but just so you can start brainstorming in case you don't have one already. And also, if we don't get to your question, because that's a possibility, feel free to write it on a piece of paper and then just hand it to one of us for us to be able to have that and answer later. So to some degree, each of y'all's work that you've done, you've either advocated for or against land use plans. It could be an area plan, it could be a comprehensive plan, all of different kinds. Or even proposed zoning changes. How critical in your perspective is a land use plan like for Dallas when advocating for fair and affordable housing? And are there any particular elements, recommendations, from your perspective, that a land use
so it might take us off track again. I think a land use plan is very important when it comes to advocating for fair housing. And when, and you're talking about how the city needs to abide by its obligation to further fair housing, and you said it must take affirmative steps to redress housing discrimination. And I think we understand that as a city when it comes to environmental injustices. That's something that Forward Dallas is doing very well. There seems to be consensus around that we know that it's been an injustice that we've placed industrial uses adjacent to residential uses, particularly in Black and brown low-income neighborhoods. So we have to right that wrong. But for some reason, it's harder for people to make that same connection when it comes to housing. But that is what we need this land use plan to do. We need it to also affirmatively further fair housing, and we need to create access to opportunity in those high opportunity areas, and we need to make sure we have diverse housing options for folks of all incomes, all races, all education levels, things like that. And so that is something I think Forward Dallas is attempting to do, but I think it is falling short. And one of the things I think it needs to include that it doesn't quite include yet, and I've seen in other comprehensive land use plans, is it has various elements, right? In other cities, you'll see a housing element, just a safety element. You'll see air quality and transportation. In the city of Dallas, we have a lot of plans, but they're all very disjointed. And if these departments are doing great work, but they're doing work in silos and they're not working together. And so I was at a Forward Dallas committee meeting last night, and someone asked a question about housing policy in Forward Dallas, and the housing representative said, well, that's for planning to determine. And then the planning representative said, well, that's for housing to determine. And we gotta be working together here. So part of our anti displacement toolkit will be making specific land use recommendations as well for inclusion in Forward Dallas. Because the piece I think that's missing is that we need more density. We know that we need more density, but how do we do that in a neighborhood context-sensitive way? And how do we make sure that that density is coming with deed-restricted affordability? Because we don't just need more density. We don't necessarily have a housing crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis. So if we are going to allow more density, we need to have a comprehensive density bonus program that exchanges that density for neighborhood-sensitive affordability restrictions.
But what if they can buy out of those restrictions?
Well, I would move the city and all of our organizations towards more shared equity housing models too. I don't know if we're ready for that conversation, but shared equity housing models like community land trusts are really the only way to maintain affordability in perpetuity for the long term. So you're looking at creating access to housing for a family, but you're also looking at stabilizing a neighborhood. And you can do that through a land trust. You can also do that through just long-term de-restrictions with resale restrictions and rights of first refusal and things like that. So there's your dog meat added up to that.
Well, I knew somebody could handle the question, but again, it's the nuances, right? So if we're allowing for density bonuses with the assumption that affordable housing is going to be built in neighborhoods where the market is investing, right? So the neighborhoods usually that have more opportunity, but then we're allowing developers to buy out of that. How are we using that funding, right? And are we using the funding to create housing in similarly high opportunity neighborhoods, or are we using that funding to create housing in neighborhoods that are high poverty and don't have access to opportunity, right? So it's all the devil's in the details. But the thing I would say about a comprehensive plan is I didn't know what the heck a comprehensive plan was until I was probably like a year into the housing department. So if you're not a Forward Dallas expert, join the crowd. But what I would say just in general, like any plan, it conveys a vision, and it's only as good as the people who are responsible for implementing it. And so density is allowed, if we're allowing more duplexes, if we're allowing fourplexes, I don't like the term multiplex because it makes you think of a really big development, but if we're allowing that to happen, where is it actually going to happen? And it's not going to happen in North Dallas. The land prices are too high. You would have a lot of resistance. It's going to be in the neighborhoods where they're also vulnerable to displacement. And so as we think about Forward Dallas, I think we need to continue to think about and plan for the repercussions of what could be a very good policy, but how is it going to impact the people in neighborhoods? And so, very supportive of Forward Dallas, but I think there's a lot of details in the implementation that we'll just have to really stay focused on.
Gosh, what can I add that hasn't already been stated? I will agree with Maureen. I am not a Forward Dallas expert either, honestly. During my tenure, I just kind of weary of all of the different plans that I take time to memorize and nothing ever happens. I will share with you the perspective from fair housing perspective. And that is, if you are not affirmatively burdened with fair housing, if your approach is to increase the density in a already area that's already disenfranchised, that already has probably enough affordable housing, that already has a high poverty rate, you're not affirmatively furthering fair housing in that plan. You are simply perpetuating discrimination in these housing policies. Any plan, right, that gives developers funds or kickbacks or whatever to build the housing ought to require some level of affordable housing. They should not be allowed to buy out. Full stop. Full stop. Maureen asked the question, if they're allowed to buy out, where are they going to use that money? Where are they going to put the housing? They're going to put it. They're not going, I'll tell you where they're not going to put it. They're probably not going to put it in an area of higher opportunity with a lower poverty rate. So there are many different ways that we can approach it, but I think it's really important that we look at it always through a fair housing lens. Is it creating a neighborhood equity, period? And it's not if you're putting more affordable housing in a community that does not have a concerted revitalization plan, and it can't be created by the developer. I've seen too many developers come forward with their own plans and they can get their housing built. Or it's not affirmatively furthering fair housing if you're not expanding housing opportunities in areas of low poverty.
Thank you all. So we have time for either one or two questions. Does anyone have a question?
I know some of you, my name is Cass, and as you guys were talking about place-based investment, I was thinking a lot about housing and neighborhood revitalization's equity and target areas that they established earlier this year, and they've committed to dedicating 50% of their funding to those areas. And I think that the aspiration is to collaborate with other departments to have sort of interdisciplinary investments, but when you think about public works and economic development, maybe EDC, like stepping into these places and creating investments, what would you hope to see? And then secondly, sort of chronologically, how should those investments relate to having policies in place around anti-displacement? Because like you were saying, the timing is really key. So, you know, take for example, like the second equity target area is around the zoo and 10th Street and like near 35. What kinds of investments would you want to see there, and then like what protections need to come first?
So it's a great question, and I'll say when I saw that the 3 equity strategy target areas all were in neighborhoods that had been historically disinvested, where we've always put our CDBG dollars because it was the easiest place to put it, I was concerned. And so I think we have to maintain a focus on mobility, like we've talked about. How are we helping families that right now have kids, have a need for access to jobs, to great schools, and other things? How are we helping them move into areas of opportunity? So that concerns me. But I think if those are going to be your equity strategy target areas, then you have to be timing those investments so that they are occurring simultaneously. So you're improving the streets, you're improving the sidewalks, you're purchasing land before prices go up too much. You are working with builders who can build. You're working with the school district to help them make investments in the schools that are in those areas. When you're giving large financial incentives to employers, you're finding ways that maybe those jobs can be located in the community, or there's an easy way for workers from that community to be hired and to be transported to those high-paying jobs. And so all those investments need to be happening and funded very early on, otherwise we lose focus. And then the only thing that happens is we build the affordable housing and we don't have anything additional to show for it in terms of neighborhood investment.
Yeah, I don't want to speak too much on those equity strategy areas because I'm not super familiar with how they were chosen, but I do know part of why they were chosen was because of the opportunity to have those cross-departmental partnerships. I don't know if that's where the equity piece comes in. So I want to know more about the equity piece. Unfortunately, I would have loved for there to be more coordination with our anti-displacement maps. Unfortunately, they weren't ready in time for that effort. But I still think that when you're looking at areas, like you mentioned, with the zoo and the deck park, if that's an area, we know that's a target area for investment. So we know there's going to be displacement pressures there. I think if you look at our maps, you'll see that it's probably in the later stage. So there are certain strategies that you want to implement early when you know land is still relatively affordable and you can acquire that and bank it and hold it, remove it from the speculative market to hold it for the public good and for affordable housing and other public services and uses. When an area is already kind of in the later stages, there's like different kind of interventions that we want to see. But with our toolkit, what we're really hoping to do is recommend kind of city-wide strategies. Like this is what City of Dallas you can do across the board, but here's where you should maybe be prioritizing your efforts based on where that neighborhood is at. But our model really looks at the concentration of vulnerable populations first, then evidence of demographic change, then housing market pressures. So it's different than some other equity approaches and displacement mapping that you may have seen before because of the focus on vulnerable populations, because we have that equity focus. So yeah, I'll just say that.
I want to echo what Maureen said. You really highlighting the need to focus also not just on the affordable housing, but also the schools. I want to also suggest that how critically important it is to talk to the people who live within those target zones. What do they want to see? We always assume that what they want to see is more housing. You may be surprised. They may want to see full-service grocery stores because so often that's missing. What other kind of amenities do the people who already live in the community want to see? And protect their right to stay. I want to echo that. Protect their right to stay in the community as it experiences the revitalization.
Thank you. And I'm one other thing. Yeah.
I don't know. Hi, I'm Lauren. I don't know if anybody's answer. First, thank you for hosting this discussion. It's really important that we talk about these things. We have
VP of Homebuyer Services was here earlier, but she just left. I would have handed the mic to her. I know we've been in that situation before, and our closings have been delayed multiple times because we're waiting. And I don't know that I have an answer for you. It's just you gotta, when you're building affordable housing, you have to make sure all parties kind of know what they're getting into, and they're as flexible as possible. Even if that means lenders are having to do their qualifications again or rerun the numbers again. I know we've been in that situation before, but that's
It's a
all.
lot of funding.
Oh, with DHAP, the delays of DHAP, I'm not entirely sure, but I assume that plays a role.
It could be, but usually we had trouble spending the money because of exactly what Stephanie said, is because it's such a complicated process because you're working with a mortgage company, a seller, and then the home buyer. So, I mean, I would work your way up the chain. I know I never liked it when people went to their elected officials, but your elected official could also be able to assist you. But I think that's also something, especially from a home buyer assistance standpoint, where we've got to find ways in the city of Dallas to have more philanthropic and private sector funding that can assist with affordable housing, because when you can reduce the strings, when you can reduce the regulations, but still deliver whatever needs to be delivered. And I think home buying is one of those things where banks are probably much more capable of managing additional assistance. So if you could take the city of Dallas out of the picture, and so a home buyer who is seeking down payment assistance could be just working with their bank and not having to have an additional set of application and approvals, it would streamline the process very much. And that's the one thing I would just say as a plug. Another action item is maybe for the first time ever, I don't know, and you may be able to tell me, but at the Texas legislature, we have both Republicans and Democrats that are advocating for affordable housing to be an area of focus during this next legislative session. Both the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House have issued interim charges that are focused on affordable housing. And I think there's an ability for us to foster both innovation and to identify regulations that maybe should be changed so that we can create more affordable housing. And I think 2025 is going to be a big year for advocating for changes at the state level.
Please join me in just thanking our panelists today for answering all these questions and providing your perspectives of how do we address this affordable housing.
Thank you. And thank you all again. Thank you, Jennifer, for moderating. We do have a QR code up here on the screen if you're interested in submitting a comment in favor of Forward Dallas and have some ideas for how the plan can be improved. We do need some broad support for the plan. There are people who are advocating against the adoption of Forward Dallas or who are promoting single-family only place types that would be regressive for the city of Dallas. So it's an opportunity for you to weigh in at the City Plan Commission level right now for some of those changes that our panelists talked about today, and also support the plan with your city council member, because it will be coming to them this August or September, likely for adoption hopefully by October, and that sets the vision for what we want Dallas to look like in the future, which is one that is inclusive, which one that does allow residents of all ages, all income levels to thrive here in the city of Dallas. So we'll leave this up. There are our website, DallasHousingCoalition.com, and social media channels already mentioned, and Jennifer has some upcoming events that she'd like to share with you all too.
So as Brian shared, the panel that we hosted today is part of a bigger movement, the housing justice movement, and it was started because of the narratives we kept hearing on the ground about only single-family place types. As you heard today, it's impossible to move forward as an inclusive city if we just keep the status quo. We already don't even know where affordable housing is on the ground. We don't there's a lot of issues that we are dealing with in the city of Dallas, and to keep waiting for this plan to pass, let me tell y'all, since 2018, the city of Dallas has been trying to work on Forward Dallas. We're already 2024. We don't have more time to wait. It's time to put the Forward Dallas, to move forward, so that we can get into the devil in the detail, put policy into action, because people are literally affected because of our city's lack of action. So, besides the panels, we have been hosting some walking tours. Stephanie joined one of them this past Saturday. So we're hosting these walking tours throughout the city of Dallas because it's important to talk about zoning and land use of Forward Dallas on the street. You know, when we're able to engage people on the front door and literally walk our city, have these conversations, and that way we're able to understand how does our lived environment get impacted by something such as zoning and land use that can get very, wonky, but it's realistically it affects the quality of air that we breathe, it affects our opportunities, and also potential displacement pressures. So we're hosting another walking tour called Latino Urbanism. Latino urbanism is something that we see throughout the city of Dallas. You see individuals who, the frontage, it might be single family, but behind you see that we have some individuals who literally have created missing middle on their own terms. Not the market's missing middle, but again, we've seen Latino communities do missing middle as a way to fend off displacement. So I always tell people missing middle is not just it's how it's actually being done, because it is being used as a tool to fend off displacement. So we're going to do a Latino urbanism walking tour, and I encourage every single one of you to join us next month and really get more into those details in West Oak Cliff. And then as well, if you're interested in getting plugged in, perhaps some of you are advanced in this housing space, or maybe you're just starting out, or maybe you just showed up and this is your first or second panel that you attended, but you're curious because you have an interest in addressing some of these issues. An opportunity that we have, Rayo Planning is hosting a volunteer orientation this Saturday. So if you're interested, just make sure to let me know. I'm happy to have you there. We don't expect you to know every single thing. We're here to just learn collectively together. And then lastly, we're also hosting a festival. So all of this is building up to the festival, because again, what we're seeing in the city of Dallas, we've gone already to the city council chambers, but what Dallas is talked about, it's not as representative. People who speak up, right, at City Hall, we know that this city is very diverse, right? But how do we make sure that the folks, the most vulnerable communities who don't have the luxury at times to show up to City Hall, that their voice is also accounted to when the horseshoe is making these decisions or they're being swayed by public comment testimony. So the festival, the purpose of that is to ensure that we have individuals in that large community show up, and we're going to have Rayo volunteers help people share their comments about housing, and we're going to share that with the city of Dallas. We're literally going to have volunteers helping people write their comments to city council and emailing that information to them the day of. So again, there's a lot of opportunity to get plugged in. As Brian shared, there's constantly hearings going on at the city council, at Dallas City Hall on Forward Dallas, and it's not the time for us to stop and just kind of see what happens. It's a matter of time to be strategic, because as our panelists shared today, context is important. We're dealing with the legacy of discrimination, racism, and segregation that's been going on before our time, right? So it's a matter of change the tide and work together for more inclusive Dallas. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. And there is a sound bath yoga session happening here at 8 o'clock, so if y'all want to hang